Hello, everyone. We are so excited to be joined today by one of my favorite people in the entire world, an inspiration to me, Catherine Ruth Pakaluk. She is a teacher. She's a professor of economics at Catholic University, but more importantly to me, she's author of Hannah's Children, the book that changed my mind from wanting 7 kids to 10 plus kids. It got me so excited about it. So we're thrilled. We're thrilled to have you on, and we're very keen to ask you some questions both about the book, but also about being a super mother. I mean, you're the mother to 14 children, 8 of them that you've given birth to. It's just insane. Like you're living this dream.
To clarify, you said 14 children.
Yeah.
But that gives you a lot of data points.
That's true. That is true.
So the first thing we were curious as we were prepping for our conversation with you and just wondering is when you published Hannah's Children, which is a book in which you really share academic research where you did qualitative interviews with mothers who had more than 5 children, or 5 or more children, I should say. When you released the book, or even when you were doing the research, what was the most controversial thing that came up, or the place where you got the most pushback or bristling?
Yeah, probably, if you want to know the truth, probably the fact that I limited my sample to college-educated women. Yeah. It's just interesting because a lot of people wanted to, number one, are you sort of saying that the only way to be like a full human being is to have a college education, which is funny because I'm like on the other end of this. I'd be more inclined to say like we've done too much college in this country and we need to kind of free up the education market, free up the credentialing market. But so that was something that came up a lot as a kind of pushback was like, you're zeroing in on sort of this a special group of people, right? Because it's not everybody.
Why did you choose college-educated women?
Yeah, well, I did because that's where in the data we really see this the correlation most strongly, right? So the more education people, women, and countries have, the fewer children they have. So really, you see what I mean? So you kind of want to go
how do
after
we
it.
figure out this post-globalization, post-female empowerment world? You're totally right. Because one of the things we were just recording an episode about was how we can't go back. How researchers have found that, for example, giving men more economic empowerment relative to women actually doesn't increase marriage rates. So like, that makes sense. Now I get it.
Yeah, that was the reason. And of course I wrote the book really for a general audience, a very wide audience. And so I didn't use a lot of space to make that case. It's like a couple sentences. And then people ask me later and they're like, oh, they didn't even read those 2 sentences. And they think like it's really elitist to just talk to college educated women. I'm like, I didn't have a lot of space here, guys. But I did, I did intentionally from my sample of people who applied to be interviewed, I did grab women from kind of all parts of the socioeconomic spectrum. So, I mean, there are women who have college degrees who aren't, living it up.
And then just to make sure you got some that were poverty in, you kept some on who wanted to get PhDs and work in academia.
100%.
There you go.
You nailed it. Like my 5 best friends. Yeah, that's right.
Right. So question here, what surprised you most of the findings or the commonalities in these women, maybe that differentiated from your own experience or that affirmed your own experience?
Yeah. Good question. Let me see. This is going to sound funny, but the first that kind of confirmed my experience was that people have reasons for what they're doing. I mean, I know this is like the whole, this is something you guys talk about all the time. You represent this in a lot of ways for so many people. And I think that's so cool, which is like, we don't end up with a lot of kids. We just don't know how that happens. Right?
Yeah.
Like, obviously, we go to great lengths to make it happen. It's something that you could with a college education or whatever else, a lot of other things you could do with your time. You could choose it on purpose. So that my hunch going into it was like women are purposeful, couples are purposeful. They're not accidentally having kids. We all pretty much know how this happens at this point, and birth control isn't that expensive. So why did you do this? So, but again, in a sense, it was a hypothesis. It had to come out of the research, which was like, people have reasons and they can say what they are. That was great. So that really confirmed my experience. Like I say in the first chapter, I know when every one of my kids was conceived and I could have avoided it. Right. So there has to be a story there. Like, what were you thinking? So that was a big thing.
Well, there's a theory that I've been building that's related to this, and we were going to go over it at the Pronatalist conference, but it's that all kids come into existence for one of 3 reasons. One is parents are practicing Jesus take the wheel. Basically just, they get pregnant when they get pregnant, they keep the kids they keep. The second category is the parents wanted a child and then did what they needed to bring that child into existence. And then the third case is the kid was conceived accidentally and the parents then kept the kid. And when you're looking at pronatalist interventions, pretty much every form of pronatalist intervention only affects. Now, we can put the Jesus take the wheel families in a different category because they're one so rare and already high fertility. But of the other two categories, every pronatalist intervention you can do only affects one category. So, for example, banning pornography, banning contraception, banning abortion, all of these increase the accident kids. Whereas economic factors, increasing house sizes, all of that stuff, that affects the intentional kid category. And that it's something that we can be really intentional about as we build out policy, but also to bring focus to the fact that if you look at where children are disappearing in the United States, we pointed that out on a lot of podcasts, you really only see a drop in the children, the number of children and women under 24. In the other categories, it's either growing or staying steady. And to me, that represents a likely accident kids in any time recently. So what actually is causing the existing fertility crash is a disappearance of this accident category of baby. And the best way to resolve this is to increase intentionality around having children and build more. And I'm wondering how you would think about doing that now that you've seen so many families that made this decision.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so if I understand you correctly, you're saying like in a sort of move people from the accident category into the intentionality category.
Yes.
Okay, so which is like totally possible to do, I think. I mean, first of all, I mean, just we can't underscore enough. Like I love the way your guys are thinking about this, and it tracks a little bit with some of the things I'm hoping to present at the Natalist. Are you guys going in person?
Yeah.
Okay, great. We're not. Great. This is going to be fun.
Using the code word natalism.org or just look up NatalCon, you can get discount tickets using the code Collins, all caps. It's March 28th and 29th this year in Austin. So just coming up.
So it tracks a little bit with how I'm trying to formulate things. But right, if people have reasons for what they're doing, then they can say what those reasons are, and they're not like hard to understand. Well, then that should inform our policy tremendously. It should have a huge impact on our policy. That's the first thing. Second thing is I talked to a ton of people who didn't like grow up wanting to have kids or not wanting to have like more than 2 kids or one kid, 1.5 kids. So people can be persuaded, they can change their mind, and that's like the most normal thing in the world. So 100%, like our focus has to be on kind of like what defines this intentionality category, where it comes from, what manner of educating kids is likely to perpetuate that, because this has a lot to do with what in the policy world would think of as preference formation, kind of, or somebody else might just say like your beliefs, like what do you believe about things. So that's more of just a way of underscoring the importance of the question.
Well, I want to dig into this actually because we sort of offline discussed a little bit of the way whys change. Like often young parents start off wanting kids. Or even a lot of kids for one reason, and they sort of build their plan, but then there's a totally different driver. And I feel like there's a pretty significant disconnect between all of the whys of high fertility families and then most of the policy focus. Like, I should ask, like, did any of the families that you're interviewing, that you interviewed before, that you're considering interviewing in the future, say like, oh, well, I got a little more money, and so then we decided we should have a big family? Like, what were some of the whys that were really common that you came across?
Yeah. Okay. So, well, I'll get to schooling in a minute. I mean, probably the number one thing was like, I really enjoyed my kid. Right. And that sounds like so simple. It's so ordinary. And yet you don't hear that as much. You don't hear these sort of stories. I mean, I would want to merge that and say like, there's kind of an interaction effect between I really enjoyed being with my kid and some kind of arrangement where people had the freedom to say, well, I'm really enjoying this kid and I could just do this full time. I mean, so that there's something there, like the woman who gave up being a doctor because she just actually turned out to hate being a doctor. But presumably her husband made enough money and they could just keep having babies. So there was this, I mean, I do think the enjoyment or the experience of having kids was a big factor for a lot of people. Then you have to ask that question, how early do you have to have that first kid to kind of realize this, like, oh, I really do like this and I'd like to do this again and again. Probably for most people, that's going to be like in your 20s.
Did you have examples of husbands who convinced their wives, and what arguments worked?
Well, I had one like famous case, and it was so famous and so bizarre that it had to be a chapter in the book. It was kind of the exception that proved the rule, because actually, right, of 55 people I interviewed, there was only one case of all the 55 of what I would call husband-led childbearing. And it was the least religious couple in my sample. So that I think is kind of fun and mind-blowing a little bit. These were not like a bunch of religious families where the husband was like, more, 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 tribe, established tribe. No, it was the least religious couple. And, I don't know a lot about him. It'd be great to go back and interview him. What I do know is, what I can say is that he was a faculty member at a really elite school, and I won't say the state because that won't help. So, he's a really successful, talented person. His wife, so dual PhD couples, when they met and they first started dating, he said to her right away, like, I want 9 kids, and
Wow.
actually she learned about it first through his mom, and she's like, why, and I guess part of the point about like, he's really bright and he was a bodybuilder and has a gym in the basement. And so you're like, okay, he thinks he's got, like, he likes his life, he likes who he is, and he wants to have more of himself. They didn't describe themselves as especially religious. They did identify as Jewish, but she said really clearly the Jewish part is separate from the having kids part. Whereas all the other Jewish women I interviewed would have said, no, like, of course, this is like the fulfillment of our religious beliefs, right? And so how did he succeed? I mean, he just said he really wanted these kids. And the way she put it, I drilled down. I'm like, look, if you don't want the kids, how do you keep going along with this? And she said, it's really hard to make it sound like he's not a dick. Like, this is what she says. And she's like, but she's like, they have this great marriage. They're really into each other. And she said, and this is, I think, really telling. And it kind of reminds me of something that our friend at More Births, the ex account More Births, said. She said, he doesn't ask for much. He doesn't want me to cook for him. He does his own laundry. He does everything. This is like the one thing he really wants from me. And she's like, we have a great marriage. And so, like, why wouldn't I just want to give that to him? And so that sounds like, in a way, so old fashioned. You're so
I make her have lots of kids, and she cooks for me, and she cleans, and she makes our money because I'm a feminist. So
full empowerment on my part.
Yeah,
that's interesting though, because we also didn't come from a religious background, and Malcolm was the one that led the interest in fertility.
See, that is interesting.
Yeah.
And then I do kind of wonder if there's part of this like secular right, this like emerging secular right, which you guys are certainly representative of in some sense. Nobody's representative of anything at the end of the day, right? But
we're certainly mixing in there.
Yeah, we're making an episode on this in the near future. One of our fans who sometimes collected data in Utah that was really interesting. Where he was looking at fertility rates of Mormons and voting patterns, and he found some really interesting stuff in this study. But one of the things that I found particularly interesting is that if you divide counties by, Mormon voted Trump, Mormon voted against Trump, non-Mormon voted Trump, non-Mormon voted against Trump. Non-Mormon voted Trump has the same fertility rate as Mormon voted against Trump. So voting for Trump is as impactful for your fertility rate as being Mormon.
Mormon in Utah.
So Trump's solution to the birth rate can just be, get on my team. It'll fix the problem.
Tech thing may be more of a thing than people realize in terms of the vitalism. One thing I was wondering was, because what I see with a lot of people, like my anecdotes, when I ask families who wanted to have a lot of kids and didn't end up having a lot of kids, is it's always, well, they had that one really bad pregnancy scare or something like that.
Yes.
Did you run into that frequently? Were these families who just didn't have that happen, or did they have it happen and they kept going?
Yeah, that's a good question. And actually, I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to come back to this, like, well, what kept them going? What was the why? And oftentimes it was really enjoying that first baby. And so, these aren't people who had like the nightmare experience with their first kid. And so the first point is like, your experience with kids actually highly influences like whether you have more kids. Like, that's a really, which kind of brings us back to like, well, what are those experiences? Do you feel, as one of the women said, like alone in a box? She says, like, we send people home from the hospital, they are alone in a box with their baby. Like,
basically.
That's a good way to put it. Actually, that's true. No wonder you wouldn't want to go back to that, for sure. So were there no bad experiences? I would say there were a couple of bad experiences where people kept going. Of course, I don't know the counterfactual. There could be, bazillions of people who were potentially like multi-parity people who had a terrible experience and didn't go on to have children. And I never interviewed them because that just wasn't part of my study design. But I did interview a few people who had bad experiences at the beginning. postpartum depression, tough kids, that sort of thing. But the description there was kind of like, we really believed what we were doing. We wanted to keep going.
Mhm.
And at some point it leveled off. So there was also this kind of interesting idea about like 3 was the hardest number of kids to have. And that, you know, if you,
Yeah, we
if you
talked about
kept
that.
going and got that far, like after that, it was kind of like, there wasn't that much else to learn. It's
Mhm.
like, it sounds like weird, but yeah, that was,
No, that's what, like after 3, well, really after 4, economies of
Mhm.
scale kicks in. And I guess with
Economies
you
of
like
scale.
came in with economies
Yeah.
of scale. Like suddenly
Yeah.
like you became mother to 6 children
Yeah.
and then
Economies
was a
of scale.
different
But I
experience.
think there's another piece, which is, you know, like one mom said something like, well, I hate, you know, she said something, I feel really bad for the people who give up after 2, because like now you're good at this. And so there's
Yeah.
this idea that like there's a skill to be learned. And if you take that 10,000 hours concept,
Yeah.
I actually haven't worked it out. How many kids do you have to do 10,000 hours of parenting? That's a
Gosh,
quick
like actually not that
computation.
much. Like you're,
Right.
you're a couple of years in, you're
Yeah, you're probably pretty close, right?
yeah, even if you're not doing a whole lot of childcare. Yeah.
Right. Because unlike the other skills, you have to like go out and do them for a few hours a day, whatever that is, like to 10 years over a few hours a day. But anyway, I mean, just take that concept. I think this is a big piece of our culture, is that people think of parenting as a binary condition, like you
Mhm.
are a parent or you aren't a parent. But there's such a thing as being like a better parent and a worse parent. And actually, I think that's why people don't like to talk about it, because it seems like you're criticizing people, like, oh, you don't have much experience. But actually, we've got to talk about parenting as a skill, in part because it's great news. It means that actually you can get better at it.
True.
Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of parenting as a skill, I mean, you've done a lot of it. I'm very curious to hear what one you would say is most misunderstood about being in a large family, a parent in a large family.
Yeah.
And 2, things that you learned after having a lot of kids, where you now, like when you meet someone who's becoming a first-time parent or they're about to start their family, you're like, let me head this off.
Yeah. That's a good point. Maybe I'll go backwards. Things that I want to head off I'm like, I look back, especially with my last few kids, and I'm like, wow, I didn't need all the stuff, like all that stuff, like those, you know, the babies, you got all like 4 different kinds of strollers and baby seats. And I just didn't
Oh
end up
God,
using it.
yeah.
No, right? All the stuff. I really, maybe there's no way to prevent that, but I think part of it is like at the beginning, you feel like it's like the crash test dummies. You feel like you need to sort of, everything has to be protected and it needs a tool or a machine.
Yes.
With my last couple kids, I just had like a thing I threw, like a backpack or a thing. And I just, the car seat never left the car. I didn't tote things around. I hardly used strollers, to be honest.
Same,
just wasn't-
actually.
Yeah, I mean, maybe because I don't live in a city, but you know, mostly if I went out with my kid on foot, I would carry the kid. So I found baby wearing to be really something that freed me up to do a lot of things.
You have
There
your
we go.
hands when you're when you're
Yeah, you
wearing your
can-
baby. you
Yeah,
have
I mean, I
hands.
used to teach classes with the baby on my back, which was great. Anyway, so I
Aw.
think there was a sense in which when I was younger, like there's just a lot of stuff. And I carried a huge diaper bag at the beginning. And then later it was like, I don't think I need more than 2 items and I can stick them in something else. You know, my pocket, like there's a diaper and a onesie in my pocket. That's it. I'm good to go, right?
It's a good pocket. That
yeah.
goes against the female
I know.
conspiracy against pockets, but
I know.
Here's a question.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on advice to people who are dating to attempt to find a partner who wants a lot of kids?
Yeah. Well, you definitely have to be upfront, right? And I think people have to match on that from the beginning. I don't know. I guess I've known a few cases where it was like, surprise, I really, but I feel like that ought to be like very high on the profile. Should be like, right. It could kind of cut through a lot of stuff. I suppose people don't want to like reduce the pool or something, but fundamentally that's what you have to do, is reduce the pool.
You get to know sooner if you filter them out earlier. Otherwise, you've just wasted 2 weeks or more.
Yeah. Yeah. Because I think if you don't have kids, I mean, right, if you don't have kids yet, it's a pretty big sell. I mean, it's a something you really have to kind of get through. But yeah, that's my number one thing with my own kids that are dating, my college students. You're like, you like my son dated a girl in the fall and they met on Hinge, and you know, and you're like, do you know if she wants kids? You know, and of course, like 3 weeks in, you know, it's like, oh, it's not going to work out. And you're like, that's what it was, wasn't it? And it's not just kids, right? It's like, well, because if anybody will say you want kids, maybe you have to be more specific. It's like, I want to get married to start a family, like right away, because that'll scare them off really quickly.
Yeah, no.
Would that have scared you off, Simone?
Well, on our second date, Malcolm was like, I want to have a lot of kids.
Yeah, but I didn't say right away. I didn't say right
didn't say
away.
right away.
Well, it
You
was on
could
the
delay
second
it.
date. It was on the second date. Yeah, it was after, and it wasn't like the first conversation. I think it's a good second date subject.
Yeah.
Once you know
don't
there's
want to let it
interest.
go. You don't want to let it go too far.
Yeah,
There's some
you
chemistry
realize.
and yeah, I mean, but I don't know that, I mean, obviously, like, look, churches do this for people, and so there's a lot of this happening in churches where you don't have to be explicit, like you're part of some tiny traditionalist group, and like everybody in this church already agrees that this is what we're going to do when we get married, and then you don't have to have all those conversations. But I think if you're just dipping into the big pool in a dating app or whatever, you're going to have to get it out there quickly.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah.
So at the beginning, I interrupted you. You were going to say the second thing that you thought was interesting in the pool of people that you had, or surprising to you.
That surprised you about the
Oh,
interviewees?
Right. Well, I guess this was interesting. I don't know. Like I'm familiar with Catholics. I'm Catholic, but I interviewed women of a bunch of different religious backgrounds and beliefs, and I didn't really know what the story was going to be. And I think what surprised me was to find out that while religious identity was strong in most of my interviewees, except for that one couple, what surprised me was how way to go, baby. Is he drinking she's drinking the beer. She's like,
Yeah, basically.
just Malcolm. That's so cute. It's a girl, right? She's a girl.
Yeah.
I remember that. Yeah. What surprised me was actually like how non-creedal the common sort of religious factors were, meaning they were kind of common across all of these different Jewish and Christian groups who sort of shared the same, or partially share the same scriptures. So this kind of like thing that you can say in sort of non-religious terms, that children are blessings. I guess it's a religious term of like a blessing, but it wasn't like, well, the Mormons have this one idea and then the Jewish women had a totally different idea, and that it was really linked to their specific religious creeds. It was pretty general. And so I think that was interesting. So I've started to think, and by the way, what was the content of that? It was this, we might call it pronatal belief. I know that's what some people like to call it, or like a conviction that children are really important, worth having. And I think what that drove me to think, and I'm really kind of thinking about this going forward, looking at the social science of religion. I mean, you've seen this Pew study that was out this week about how like Christianity stopped falling. I guess the number of people who identify as Christians stopped falling. So it's not exactly like it's rising, but it stopped falling. I know, exactly.
Good.
Like that's what Ryan Burge is calling it, saying like maybe we hit the floor of, and so, but I think that the study of religion, the scientific study of religion in this country has got to move past like just these denominations. Like that's as much as we do. We just sort of survey. And what I'm finding is there's this like minority group in all these different religious groups that has this very strong, we could say, biblical set of principles or beliefs about the value of having children. And if you want to know who's having kids, it's like that's who you have to find. It's like the 5% of Mormons and the 5% of Catholics and so it's religious. It is religious for those people, but you couldn't find them just by finding out who's religious. You'd have to dig into, so it's like intersect the being religious with this specific belief. So it's like, what kind of religion?
Did you find any unifying? Was it that they also lived in really high fertility communities? Like, were there correlatory factors that seem to indicate like, okay, so this is what makes them that 5% of Mormon or Catholic or whatever it may be that is really high fertility?
Well, I'd be hesitant to draw a strong conclusion from my relatively small sample, which wasn't representative, but I did have like all kinds. I mean, I did have people who did live in these smaller communities, but a lot of times like they went to move near them. So they got this belief or they became convinced of this. And then that's why they sought out the community. So the causality went in the other direction. It's true. I had one lady who moved to a community because of a school and then met a bunch of people and was like, okay, I can keep going. But then you've got the couple in chapter 7 and they just are like opening the Bible and they feel like, they're Jesus take the wheel types. And they just are off by themselves at their own church in the Rocky Mountains. So I think we need to do more research on that. I think there were certainly cases where clearly that orientation or belief was coming out of how they had been educated, how they've grown up. And that's a piece that's relatively understudied. So it's something we can take to the data in the next couple of years and kind of ask like what types of schooling most predict higher birth rates. My hunch would be we'd see a lot of homeschooling, we'd see a lot of private independent schools, like micro schools, co-ops, things like that. That'd be my hunch, but I haven't asked the data yet.
Yeah, we'd love to see more research on that too. And like in terms of, go ahead,
what you're talking about, the idea of these high fertility sub-factions of these religious communities is participation in them intergenerational? Like, does it persist with fidelity, or do they deconvert to the other type of Christian within this community? Have you seen?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's the question. There's been a little bit of work on intergenerational transmission of values in that I looked at in European data. But my problem with that data, because it would argue that basically like religious groups don't pass on their values like particularly well. But I would argue that the thing that they're not looking at is the beliefs of the groups. Like it's not granular enough, because some people clearly are. And so, you just need to get more granular. What type of religious group is it? And then how do they educate their kids? We know that sort of alternative schooling isn't that common in Europe. So if I were to guess, I would say that that's the missing link. But
I don't know. I'm going to push back here. I think that a lot of people who are from religious backgrounds, when they see things like the rate of religion stabilizing or growing, what they think it is families getting better at keeping their kids within the religion. And what it actually is people joining new types of religion that are radically different from their parents' version of Christianity.
Yeah.
And I've seen increasingly poor rates of keeping kids, especially within the incredibly conservative iterations of religions. One of the things I was telling Simone recently that I didn't know is apparently, and I've got to look for more information on this, but the FLDS, you know the FLDS are? FLDS are the most extreme. Those are the Mormons that have like multiple wives and dress kind of frumpy. Apparently, they just held their third gay pride parade this year.
2 towns on the Utah-Arizona border with deep roots in the FLDS church will celebrate Pride this weekend.
Jenna Bree shows us how queer people are openly showing their colors.
An area known for its polygamous community and ties to the fundamentalist LDS church.
The history of the town, I feel like it kind of gets a bad rep.
Last year, Short Creek Pride was included in the 4th of July parade, and Aldrich says they plan on marching with their community again this year.
Like we're seeing within the most extreme factions of these religion communities, they're losing young people to woke, like at a way higher rate.
Which is really shocking. It's not what I would expect, because I thought they were more culturally isolated.
It's what I'd expect if you have a cultural preference for high authority and following what the average of the community is pressuring you in terms of value systems.
Yeah, interesting.
So one thing,
go ahead. I was going to say that we definitely have to study this more because we don't really know.
More data is needed. I want to hone in on something that you said about sort of the factor that made people want to have a lot of more kids, which is that first kid, is that they really like it. Like they have one and they get hooked. And I think Malcolm and I got hooked after 2 or 3. Like it wasn't like we think the hardest number of kids to have is 1. It's just like you're doing everything for the first time. It's just so stressful. But I'm also curious from a policy or cultural design or lifestyle design standpoint, if you came across factors that you think correlated with that being a good versus bad experience, like basically being alone in a box with your kid, sort of terrified and alone, versus super enjoying what we think is like the hardest stage, first time with everything.
I'm reaching. It's not something that I would certainly say, I was going to say sounds obvious. Like I would certainly say for me, the hardest transition was 0 to 1. I think in terms of like just the chaos of parenting, it was harder. Like at 3 or 4 or 3 toddlers was really tough. But like the lifestyle change, like the psychological shock was biggest from 0 to 1. There she goes again. But I had a lot of kind of cultural capital coming into that because I came out of a large family. So I kind of had this vision, like it's going to get better.
You'd seen it before.
And I feel like that's probably the me, like that would have to be, but then, then you kind of bump into this, I think it's one of the reasons why lower birth rates beget lower birth rates, like how you get into these traps that keep cycling down. Because I think that the fewer kids there are around, the less you have like a belief that it will get better. You haven't seen it before. So you don't have any context to interpret how difficult that is.
At one point in the book, you do talk about the shortage of people growing up in America who even have had exposure to infants in their entire lives. Like maybe when they have a kid, that's their first time encountering a young human, which
Yeah.
definitely was pretty much the experience for me, for example.
Yeah.
So do you
Yeah.
think that's a big
I think
factor?
that's a huge factor. I think it's got to be a huge factor. I mean, I did some back of the envelope, calculations, like how many years of your childhood would you have been exposed? Like even if you had one sibling, which is a pretty
Right.
normal family these days, 2 kids.
Yeah.
Well, like most normal people are going to have their 2 kids in probably maximally like a 5-year span,
Mhm.
which means that by the time your brother or sister is born, you're like 2. By the time you're 6, you're not going to remember a baby. By the time you're 12, a baby never happened in your house, right? So I think that's got to be enormous. Like, and then you don't have cousins nearby, and then that's it. That's got to be really big.
And
And
when you
it's so
connect that-
strange. Like, well, think about like you're in the hospital and like you've got these unrelated human beings who are like, let me show you how to put a baby on your boob.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean,
and change a
you just-
diaper.
And you think about like the dogs and the cats and that, like, you think what a weird species that we like need someone to show us how to feed our offspring.
I had
so
Yeah.
odd.
question which I hadn't thought to ask before, but I guess it's actually really important for this new theory I have. If you were going to estimate what percentage of these high fertility families, 5 kids over when you were talking to them, didn't plan on their children, i.e. they were using a full Jesus take the wheel thing, not tracking their cycles, not anything like that, versus what percent do you think really intended on having every kid they had?
Yeah. Well, I'm pretty sure because I did ask, like I asked about every kid in the interview. It doesn't necessarily come out in the book. I'm pretty sure it was like 1 out of 55 was the Jesus take the wheel case.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was my
I would-
thought as well. That's
yeah.
incredibly rare. I was
Yes.
talking with a Catholic reporter about this, and I was like, it's
Yeah.
rare within Catholic communities. And he was like, what makes you think that? And then
No.
Simone had
think
great
it's
evidence for
incredibly
that,
rare.
where she said, well, they tracked their cycles so well that they were the first to realize the vaccines were causing issues. The only reason you would know
Interesting.
your cycle that well.
Yes. Yes, exactly. I don't think they would mind if I shared this case, but well, I'll just say I know a young couple. I won't say who they are, but they got married. They're Catholic. They got married. They knew because they were tracking before they got married because they wanted to have kids. They knew that they got married like on peak fertility.
Oh my gosh, amazing.
Like, nobody would know that. And so like they got off their honeymoon and knew that there was a good chance they were expecting because they had gotten married on peak fertility, tested at the earliest possible minute. So but like under 2 weeks from their wedding, they knew they were expecting. And you
Nailed
get
it.
and you get people looking at them like you definitely must have like gotten pregnant before you got married. But that's because people don't understand how granular that is and how much you can know about your cycle. So that's really interesting. I only met one family. I put them in the book because again, like my job was to display the whole diversity of it. The general story was that people did intend and knew exactly when they got pregnant. But there was that one couple that in chapter 7, they were like, we didn't ever do anything to plan or to Yeah. So I think it's really rare. And I think that's what we should expect. Like, I think people are smart and they learn stuff. And
Well, I don't think it used to be that way. I think that this
No.
is that used to make up maybe 30% of some population's birth rate, maybe 50, 60
Well,
years ago.
yeah, I think that's correct. And it's one of the reasons why, I don't know, some people's sort of naive idea that we could just like ban birth control would somehow like change the picture. I don't think it would change the picture.
It might for like communities in poverty that are really uneducated.
No, but even like with
Yeah.
apps being what they are now, I think people find a way. Also, historically, you can see different birth rate trends, and when economic prosperity goes up, suddenly birth rates go up too. Like people have always kind of had a ways, even without the apps, even without the scripts you can pee on. There have been so many ways for people to take care of their fertility.
I mean, probably probably like the teenagers and the kids that like people who aren't planning to have sex, and then all of a sudden so they weren't tracking or something. But that's that third category, the shrinking, this kind of accidental ones. But I think among the people who like are coupled up or would like to be coupled up, I mean, I think people they're either using birth control, or they're tracking. Tracking is becoming incredibly common. And it's like so easy to do it at this point. I do think that's going to be a huge piece of the future.
What percent of the kids were in public school?
Of the kids of the women that I talked to?
Yeah,
like their
yeah.
kids?
Oh, I'm
Was there a big
curious.
fear around public school in these communities, or was this not as much
That's
of
a great question. You've asked me a question for which I don't have a ready answer. I didn't total that up. But if I'm just thinking through the people I talked to, it was certainly under 50%.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, I mean, I see
It
throughout the
wasn't
prenatal
nothing, but
community
it was
is being terrified. we have our kids until middle school in public school, or until they say they don't want to be there anymore. And our own community is like, you can't put that, like, what are you doing?
Amazing.
You know, so
Yeah.
we'll see.
Yeah, we'll see. Well, I mean, I think this is the kind of a funny moment to talk about schooling, because I think like 10, 15 years from now, the menu of options that are going to be out there for schooling is going to be so diverse and so different from what we have now.
Well, the Collins Institute is improving so quickly. We're adding an
Yes.
AI test and tutor to it, which should be ready by this
Great.
summer.
That's
We're
great.
trying to like make possible at scale and very
Yeah.
affordably aristocratic tutoring, which just seemed
Yeah.
like such a great way of learning, you know, just being able to explore what you like and talk to someone who could help guide you through it and not be, you know, taken through this industrial system. But yeah, I mean, I think a big factor that we look at certainly with pronatalism is just school choice and educational freedom, because there does seem to be this element of mainstream culture that just takes the focus away from that point that you point out of just kids are good. You know, kids are a blessing, kids are good. And that is this really important meme that takes place with high fertility. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on like other ways that a country trying to improve its birth rates can do that. I mean, when you were talking about your exposure to babies thing, for example, I was thinking about, I think it was in Australia, that one case where the birth control program where teens had to take home baby dolls. They were like, oh wow, I can handle this. This is great. Like they got exposed even just to fake baby dolls, and it encouraged more fertility, which is crazy. But then there's counterexamples of like watching teen pregnancy reality TV really successfully reducing rates of teen pregnancy because they saw it as like low class or undesirable or disastrous. And I'm curious if you saw anything among the families. I mean, it sounds like even within your family, with your kids who are dating, there are some discussions on like, well, I mean, do the partners want to have kids? How do you promote a pronatalist kids are a blessing culture within your own family? And how have you seen the families you've spoken with do it in a way that's not like, you know, creepy or backfiring?
Right. Well, there's probably a lot of things to say. In terms of like the policy stuff, by the way, I wanted to say that I think I'm hopeful that like the remote work stuff is going to keep going, because I think
fingers crossed. Yes.
I think that's been I mean, look, I work remote. I mean, although I have a job that wouldn't have been called remote work for a long time. But when I was in college and I knew like I wanted to have kids and be able to have kids, I remember looking at the menu of options. I was like, well, I'm doing economics and math, and there's a strong pull to do Wall Street or finance at that. And I'm looking at it like, you have to be in your actual office, like 40, 50, 60 hours a week. That's not going to work if I want to have a couple of kids. So I'm looking at it as a young person thinking, how come like academics aren't like all with a huge family? Because I'm thinking to myself,
that is what blows my mind. It seems like the
these people have very flexible jobs, right?
Yes.
So
why?
Yeah, well, I think like academia is like tilted left and sort of antenatal, as long as I can. I mean, certainly for 100 years, if not more.
Have you run into antinatalists yet?
At university or in general?
Within your job or within your promotion?
Yeah, for sure. I get emails from them a lot.
Okay.
I'm like, oh, those are. Yeah, I mean, like the nastier ones are the ones who send you these little. Do you guys get them? Like little handwritten, scrawled notes, and you're like,
oh yes.
I'm looking at this script and like, I think you're 95 and you're in the Bay Area.
Was it on a used like bill envelope? Because that's what we got. Like, the ones with the windows of like, he just used, recycled, because he cares about the environment. There are too many people. So he's reusing.
Oh yes. They're like, you are
just like filled with old bills and stuff like that. And like rotting books.
No, exactly. No, they do. They come out of the woodwork. They send you, letters, and you're like, you're so old and you're so out of touch. Like, who is paying your bills? Like, buddy, this is just outrageous. So I don't have any colleagues or I haven't experienced anything super nasty personally.
That's good.
But the antinatalists are out there.
Catholic university though, so
you would think, but I will say, like, politically, it's all over the map. Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
Catholic, but university, Malcolm, university.
Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah, I should probably just leave it there.
So and that makes sense though. I mean, because when we speak with academics, especially when they're young, they're like, well, no one would take me seriously if I got pregnant and all these things. And I've been told not to have kids. And I mean, actually the same thing happened to us when we were in private equity. We had people be like, well, don't have kids until you've completely gone through the entire process and sold your company. And we're like, oh, should we not tell him that we're pregnant right now? Like,
Yeah.
this is, and we just did it.
Yeah.
And that's the thing, is you have to just do it.
You
Don't
just
ask
have
for
to do
permission.
it.
You just have
Yeah.
to do it.
Well, my
But yeah, you're
husband's
right.
not on this. My husband's not in this conversation, but at some point the four of us will sit down together, and like, you guys are not short on confidence, and like, we're kind of similar. We're like, well, my way or the highway. So,
Yeah.
but it's true that definitely in the 80s and the 90s, like, there's this very normie kind of thing, which was like in academia, you had your you finished a degree, you got tenure, and then when you're like 38, you would kind of start having a couple kids.
Yes,
And it
yes.
like didn't work for a lot of people, and little by little, people were like, oh, kind of. So one of my advisors was a female, and she really never said anything outright, but at some point she dropped me the tiniest line and said, how did she put it? She said, you're narrow, like your narrowly focused peers will regret their narrowness later.
Oh.
And I thought, like, that's not exactly a encouragement, but it's also not a discouragement. So it was kind of,
that's pretty.
it's pretty good for the
yeah.
ivory tower,
A broadly antinatalist environment. That was her like Underground Railroad hint to you.
She didn't have kids, and most of the women in the faculty didn't have children. But you never really know. Like, some people.
Did she already know you were pregnant when she said that, though?
Yeah, that was like, I was like 3 kids in, and I'm sort of like, oh, I'm sorry I didn't get you this stuff. I'm slow,
Oh,
She was like, she was a little, she's the one voice of like, don't worry too much about it.
oh.
Which was, I really am. I'm really grateful. I probably saved that message someplace. I thought it was like a miracle. But I mean, especially when I was in my 20s, I didn't think of trying to find out why the childless women on the faculty didn't have kids. Like, was it because they had waited too long and couldn't, or is it because they didn't want to? I never asked her. Yeah,
Interesting.
Seemed impertinent.
I can't remember if this was mentioned in many of your interviews, but did you find any trends with male versus female task sharing within the household? I mean, because there was a pretty good mix of, like, there were some women who were full-time mothers. There were some women who had sort of hybrid part-time careers. There were some women who were like fully in.
Yeah.
Was there a pattern?
What I heard a lot of was a lot of nice stories. I mean, again, mostly people volunteer to talk to an interviewer about their family size. You're certainly not getting the people who are really upset about how things are going. So, I mean, I realize there's a bias there, but I got a lot of nice stories about, I mean, I guess I would say, like, we would broadly think of it as like, we've figured out a way between us to kind of like share tasks in a way that is kind of division of labor-ish. And I would say that in general, it was kind of traditional looking. And there's like that one quote from the academic couple at the beginning of the book. And she says at the end of that chapter, she says something like, we started out like kind of progressive and egalitarian. We're like, we're going to split everything 50-50, whatever. And she's like, but here we are with 5 kids. And it's kind of weird how traditional it's turned out to be. It's not intentional. It's just, it was like we each leaned into our strengths, and this is what we got.
Yeah.
Whereas, you had the couple where he was staying at home full time. So I guess I would say I heard a lot of stories about when you have a lot of kids, there's a lot going on. Like, your household is certainly a complicated, almost as a small enterprise, right? It's something else that you have your work to manage, and you have this other enterprise. And if you're doing it well, you've got, like, you're developing your kids, and so that, because it's an enterprise, we do the thing that we do in human life generally. We sort of like, we make rational decisions, like, you're better at this, so you do it. So I wouldn't say, like, I knew this guy, he's an academic. I knew him through conferences, and they were homeschooling, and their deal was like, he did all the cooking because he was so good at it.
Oh, wow.
And he loved it. And it was the deal because she was homeschooling. So she was like, well, by the time my day is over, I've had it. And he just did so I wouldn't say I got like this really long list of sort of like super tratty looking things, but rather sort of like, it's worked out well because, he's good at some stuff, I'm good at some stuff. And efficiency means that's how you do it. You just, like,
it actually
you're better
says a
at
lot,
this,
though.
right?
That's pretty radical, because I think modern marriages are often like, we are peers, we each do exactly the same thing, maybe we make almost exactly the same amount of money, with the male making a little bit more. And with children, everyone has to do exactly the same thing interchangeably, and otherwise it's not, it's like, misogynistic.
Early on, I mean, my husband and I didn't have any real, like, we don't have any like principles about who does what. But I figured out really quickly, like, if I divided up like the night times equally, I was like, you take this night and I take that night, the kid was going to not be happy. And I was going to not sleep well. So it was going to be like not a good deal. So I'm just like, okay, I'm nicer in the middle of the night, and I want my kids to have a nice life. So I'm going to see them in the middle of the night. But if we were to fast forward and like look at their teenage years, their early teen years, he does so much more with them in terms of like taking them to sports stuff.
Oh, that's
cultivating
interesting. So like
talents,
stages of life too.
stages
One
of life.
parent will come in more.
Because I would say like
Oh.
now, now I'm working a lot more than I did when they were babies. And he is kind of, in a sense, I don't want to say over the hill. That's not right. He's very productive, but he has done enough in his profession that he has time to. So he's like, taking him to, he oversees the piano lessons, he oversees the music, he oversees the sports. And I'm so glad, because those are the things that I'm not really that good at. I'd be way inclined to be too much of a gentle parent. Like the minute they're crying over a piano lesson, I'd be like, all right, that's it. We're done. We're saving that money. My husband's like, no, this is so good for them. We're doing this. We're going to push through it. So, I'm glad I was the person that was getting up in the middle of the night, because I think the babies were better for it, better off for it. But we didn't go into marriage with like this game plan. Like, this is how we're going to do it. Right. You just sort of go hit the moment. And you're like, yeah, I'll take him at 2 a.m. Like, you suck at this. It was like basically true.
And you touched on something though, talking about that, you do invest in some activities for your kids. And we also talked about sort of frugality at the beginning of this conversation briefly. We one of our big arguments is that parenting is completely overblown now. Like, people very unsustainably parent their kids, and that's why they're like, well, I can't afford to have a kid, but they're basically raising a millionaire, like a retired playboy. And like, I don't know why you think that's normal. Like, it hasn't been for the vast majority of humanity. And I feel very conflicted on this. Like, I don't want to, both Malcolm and I are like, we want to give our kids everything. We also want to be reasonable. We don't want to spoil them. We don't want to coddle them. And we also don't want to clutter their lives with things they don't need. Like, to your point, like we all get too much stuff. So where have you found it to be like really useful to invest in things in your kids? And where have you just decided like, we don't need to spend money on this?
Yeah. Well, I definitely think skills and things that are really challenging to learn. I think it's hard to self-teach. And a lot of those types of things, like, I would say certain academic things. I mean, like, you could do a lot in math and languages that your local schools aren't going to be able to do. You can invest in tutors if you can't do it yourself. Those are things that are hard to just tell your kid, like, just pick it up, right? Whereas, some of the skills my kids have are things that, because we didn't have tablets, they didn't have devices, they didn't have video games, like, they went outside and did stuff. And those are things we really underparented in that sense. So my 3 oldest sons are all like kind of really accomplished fishermen. I don't know anything about fishing, and neither does my husband.
Did they just go out and figure it out one day?
Yep, they 100% did.
How did you not get CPS called on you? This is the mystery.
We lived in Florida. Well, this is the funny thing about it. We moved there. I thought my kids were going to get eaten by alligators, and but we had like, there's water everywhere, and the kids are like, can we go to Bass Pro Shops? We want to learn to fish. Me being this like northern sort of like educated, safety conscious mom, I'm like, they're going to die. Like, they're going to get sharp stuff, and of course, like, I know nothing at this point. I know nothing, And then I think it was the grandma that brought him to Bass Pro. Like, it wasn't me, right? So the grandma brought him over there. They go out there with their stuff. And then like the next thing, I don't see them for 4 hours. And so you're like, hey, this is kind of good. Like, that's good for them, right?
Yeah.
But actually the end of the story is really kind of cool. Like, they became such good fishermen because of all the time they spent unsupervised, just kind of figuring it out. So it's kind of a mixture. There's a great story about them kind of in their mid-teen years when they went out on a charter sea fishing boat. And it was like a neighbor brought them on this thing, and it was like a fancy thing. So they're out in this deep sea boat like off the Gulf Coast of Florida, and the captain says they can't line up shoulder to shoulder on that rail. Like, they'll get their lines crossed. The boat's moving, the water's moving. And so you could see that would be reasonable. And the neighbor guy that took him, he said, no, I think they'll be okay. And anyway, later the captain said, I've never seen 3 men stand shoulder to shoulder and not screw up. He said, but that's just, they stood shoulder to shoulder doing
how
this,
they
like,
learned.
how they learn, so they're great fishermen. So I think there's some mixture of like, there's a bunch of things you want to throw your kids at that allow for that kind of like just organic learning and lots and lots of time. But, music lessons, most kids they're not going to persevere.
Our kids wouldn't do music lessons. No.
Who knows? I think for developing inhibitory control, that's amazing. Like, one of the things that I've read that really stuck with me is that all humans now in like sort of developed societies have lost the ability to sit with discomfort. And that a lot of building resilience and maturity is about learning how to be uncomfortable and not to immediately freak out and think something needs to be fixed if you are not happy and serene.
That's
And I
huge.
think that
Yeah.
things like music lessons, when it's just like, this is actually really frustrating and kind of boring, and I'm not
Yeah.
enjoying myself, is like, that
Yeah.
is building that muscle for you.
Yeah.
So I like that, especially in the absence of a really strict religious environment where you're like fasting and giving
Yeah.
all these things up and like, you know, spending like 3 hours at mass every day, like things like that.
Right.
Cause that also could do it, but
It could do it.
not everyone's
Most people
doing
aren't.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Most people don't. Yeah.
So, question: where do you see the most? Because you've mentioned a number of guys cooking. Where do you see the most gender nonconformity in large parent families in terms of the roles that are taken on?
Ooh.
That's a good question. Probably a lot of like shuttling kids around. Like if you've got to
Chauffeur
drive to,
services.
I think, because I think one
I
idea
do that.
Yes,
do.
see, I think, well, I think there's this idea of like the soccer moms, right? I mean, that was like the soccer moms with the minivans. It was like not a dad thing, it was a mom thing. But I think that with the larger families, dad just because of the number of trips, dads have to get involved with that. I think that's it's softly at least a gender nonconforming thing. I think cooking is,
Cybertruck dads are the new
yes.
soccer moms.
Oh no, funny.
That's it. It now
Funny.
makes sense.
Yeah.
What dads?
Cybertruck dads.
Cybertruck?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think that cooking, I think maybe tutoring or kind of helping kids. I mean, I did see, I don't think we've talked about this yet explicitly. I think there were a couple of, sort of the interaction with these kind of alternative forms of schooling, because a lot of the dads are kind of getting involved with tutoring or helping the kids with schooling. There were a couple of couples who kind of hit that place where they had kids in private schools and then realized like, we're either going to have another kid or we're going to keep schooling and we want another kid. And then you hear like, well, that's when we turned into homeschoolers. And so that means dad's involved with a lot of stuff during the daytime, maybe coming working from home or kind of juggling in and out. So I think that those are all kind of slightly, he's not wearing a dress, but they're also like slightly gender nonconforming. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Bedtime, bath time. I mean, I was just gonna say that's a big one. Yeah. There you go. I think because there's this idea like mom's pretty like tapped out by the end of the day.
But when mom's pregnant again, she's got to go to sleep early.
Yeah,
exactly. I know. Leaning over a bathtub with that belly is a terrible thing.
Yeah, not
I
ideal.
forced you to do that, Simone, because you don't trust me.
Yeah, actually, I do the baths because a bath with Malcolm is not to my standards.
It's a bath.
Yeah. See, that's like middle of the night parenting is not to my standards with my husband. He just,
I think that's
he'd be like, I solved the problem. I just let the kid cry to sleep.
And you're like,
I'm like, oh yeah, you didn't solve the problem.
Yeah.
You just turned the kid into like an anxious wreck for the rest of her life.
Yes. Oh my gosh, no. I think that's the interesting thing too about how division of labor plays out. It's both what you're inclined to do and what you like to do, but also like where you can't tolerate your partner's standards, and then
that's right.
Then you take it on.
Exactly.
Which makes sense. Like to your point, like you're too gentle parenting around some things like piano lessons where the kids get frustrated.
No,
like
I would fold
like,
immediately. No, I would
handle it.
fold. I'm like, that's it. I can't. The kid is
Yeah,
crying.
no, we're
I can't
not.
do it.
I mean, we get into trouble for barely beating our children.
Barely.
But it's interesting. I've talked to my wife. It's very interesting how we both intuitively have such similar beliefs around, punishment and the way I always get so happy when I see that she actually punishes a kid, and I know that everyone else is going to tell her to.
Well, keep it like for context. The last time he was berated by another parent in public, it was merely because he removed one of our children from an arcade because that child had stolen a toy from another girl who then started crying.
The horror, like what a terrible person you are.
Malcolm was berated about breaking the cycle of trauma and like all these things, and like Malcolm didn't hit the kid.
Goodness.
Malcolm just was like, we have to go home now.
I only didn't hit the kid because I was afraid of being yelled at too. I
would better.
would have been
Just hit
like,
the kid.
little shit.
Well,
you're self-regulating a little bit there.
Yeah, he's too self-conscious.
I don't want my kid to grow up to be a hippie.
Yeah, terrifying.
That's so funny. Yeah.
Well,
but these are
so. Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, these are all things that like really grow out of experience. I mean, the first time you think like maybe you have to smack your kid because they're reaching for something dangerous, and you kind of realize like it actually doesn't ruin anything. Your kid doesn't like love you any less, and then actually like over time it creates a sort of a cycle of trust and exchange where the kid knows they're safe, and I mean that's all good and that's kind of like how it's meant to be. But these are definitely ways that parents make, or I don't know if it's not that they mean to do it this way, but it ends up making parenting so much harder, right? Like if your kids are well disciplined, well raised from when they're young, like they're not terrible in their teenage years.
This is true.
This
This is
not
very
terrible.
That-
How old is
it's-
your oldest?
Our oldest is 4, so we're
4.
still pretty
Yeah,
pretty
so
young.
you're
in
in the payoff stage yet.
But also, like, I don't know if the payoff stage is ever going to come, because even though like our kids are broadly honorable, they're also like, we know genetically, like from just the other family members that have gone through adolescence and adulthood, that the rebelliousness will not stop no matter what we do. So we
Well,
can more
you
just
may
be
have-
like, this is the price.
I
Like the
love
new
Steve
threading in our
Peterson's
language is like,
parenting advice.
this is the price of this activity. Like everything is a tax. You know, you can speed, you might get a speeding ticket, but it may be worth it, even if you have to pay that like whatever fine, because you need to get there. And we're like, yeah, maybe you're going to do this. This will be the price if you do it. Cross the line, pay the price. But like,
that's too funny.
That's all we can do now. We can just try to be like the real world. We can't develop some kind of like honor or morality.
You have to learn when you have kids. There's this category of kids. I don't know if other kids are like our kids, but there's this category of kids where somebody's like, how much do you like punish your kids? Like how hard do you hit your kids? And I'm like, hard enough so that they don't laugh. Because if it's not hard enough, it's just hilarious.
And they're having fun. Yeah.
It's a blast.
Yeah, they don't think it's a game.
And I'm like Jordan Peterson being like, I just sit that child down at the end of the table and I just wait him out. And I'm like, wow, your kids are really different from mine.
Yeah, that's a lot of time too, by the way. I'm like, I got stuff to do, you know.
Yeah.
I do not know how he does it. Yeah. I do not know.
Definitely in our parenting, that's been different for different kids, right? Like
that's true.
Each kid is pretty different. We've had some kids, you just look at them funny, they're crying.
Oh my gosh,
so all you need to do, right? It's just like, no, you know, and you wrinkle your, and they're like, why are you yelling at me? You're like, you didn't yell. Nobody was yelling. But they just are so sensitive. That's how it feels to them. And then the other
daughter was like that when she was younger, but she grew out of that phase.
Yeah, now she just, the important thing for her is that she makes eye contact with you while breaking the rule, smiling.
Yeah.
She just like loves to see your
Is that your
devastated
oldest?
face.
Is that your
the
oldest?
youngest.
Oh, the youngest. Okay, that's your baby.
Titan. It's our number 3.
Intentionally break rules ever. Like Octavian almost never breaks rules.
Is that your oldest?
Yeah, that's our oldest.
He'll punish the other kids if he sees them breaking a rule.
But I think that's a very common first child thing.
That is a very common first child thing. It doesn't mean that they don't have some other interesting things going on, but they're kind of like, they figured out the system. They're like, those are the rules, all right? Like, but there's something else. Like I always like the kids later would be like, you never knew what Joe was doing behind your back. Like
that's that's the thing that at least Octavian has revealed to us as the eldest, is that he likes the rules because then he believes that he has the right to impose them. And at one point we were trying to like adjudicate things between them, and he was like, don't talk to the little ones. Like they were in his domain. He rules them. And I think maybe that's the first kid.
And actually, that's a great point we haven't touched on, which is like the community of the children, right? Like how there's this cool thing that when you have a bunch of kids, like they actually take on their own community. There's like the parents, and then there's the kids, and they kind of like practice politics. They practice like all kinds of like, they make societies and they have their own rules and, you know, like pecking orders, and it's got to give them something that this useful stuff that they take into society.
Absolutely. Yeah. And when I think of like really brilliant people that like, I'm reading his one of his books again, David Sedaris. Like I love his writing. I think he's brilliant. Great
writer.
So much of his writing is about growing up in a family of 6 kids. And it's about the politics of them when they were young and the things that they got up to. And you realize just how much kids really raise each other. And I love that because Malcolm and I are very flawed people, and we don't necessarily believe that we have everything right.
Speak for yourself.
I'm a very flawed person. My husband is perfect and beautiful.
Malcolm is perfect and a hero and a saint.
But I love that, like, with every additional kid we have, that is one more moderating factor. Where if we're wrong, maybe they'll be right, and they sort of make everything a little more reasonable. But
yes, and if you ask kids later, it's really interesting because I don't think as parents we ever really get our feel for it. They often have a completely different story about what it was like. You know what I mean? Like, we imagine it's this, and they have this completely different story. And that's I don't think we can ever bridge that, but it's a great point you're making that our children can moderate kind of the experience of life for our other children.
Yeah, huge benefit. Huge benefit. Oh my gosh, I want to thank you again for writing Hannah's Children, for doing that research.
You're welcome.
I do think that this is like, again, looking at how to move forward, because we can't go back. You have to look at these populations. What do educated people who have a lot of kids do? What do they say? What do they think? And to your point about, you know, young people being exposed to babies, I think to a great extent, adults being exposed to high fertility families, even
Yes.
just through your book, is
Yes.
it has a very birth rate
Yeah.
increasing property, because it
Yes.
definitely did that to me. And
Yeah.
I'm not the only mother who's read your book and been
No.
like, I'm in for
We
more.
could do
Because
more.
you see, because you
Yes.
just like feeling like you get to know these families,
Yeah.
and you did great interviews with them.
Thank you.
It just really makes it seem doable.
Yeah.
And I think, you know,
Yeah,
most
it
people,
is.
when they have a lot of kids, it's just people act like you're crazy.
Yeah.
And then you're like, well, I must be crazy.
Yeah.
I can't do this. And this
Yeah.
makes it seem doable. So everyone, if you haven't actually read this book yet, you've got to read this book. If you have a girlfriend who you want to maybe have considering like having more kids,
Mhm.
like, or a wife, like maybe give it to her as a gift, with other really nice things as well, of course. Maybe
Yep.
like, you know, some help around the house cooking, driving kids
Yep.
somewhere. But yeah, thank you
Yep.
so much for coming on
You're
this
so
podcast.
welcome.
And we'll see you at NatalCon.
We'll see you in Austin in like a
Yeah.
month. This is the
Looking
countdown.
forward to it.
I know,
Yes.
it's great.
Oh,
All
yeah,
right.
1 month from today. Good.
Yes,
All right. Well,
1 month
thank
from
you very
today.
much.
You're so welcome.
Have
Bye.
a spectacular
Yeah.
day.
All
All right,
right.
I'm going to end the recording here. That was fantastic. Really like keeping the house at 55.
Okay.
We're paying like
Wow.
$600 for electricity. So
Wow.
this is how it goes. But you know, I think a lot of it like comes down to you point out in
Yeah.
Hannah's Children,
Yeah.
again and again, how families just sort of choose to prioritize their
Yeah.
kids too for these
Yeah.
other things.
And I think there's there's a connection between thrift and having a lot of kids. I don't think I've got it like mathematically worked out, but it seems to be true.
Yeah.